Christian family structures were imposed and Indigenous culture was discarded. But this was not a healthy modeling of Christian families within the authoritarian and abusive rules of the IRS. So maternal and paternal care in the IRS often consisted of cold, authoritarian relationships with widespread abuse and sexual abuse. So it's just important to recognize how the effects of the IRS have now manifested itself in the change in parenting styles seen today, creating vulnerability and dysfunction in families, children being raised in foster homes, Indigenous girls being raised in such a crazy environment, venturing outside for the home for support and running away. A study was done in 2013 to examine the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the welfare system. They found that while only making up 9% of the child population in Alberta, 59% of Indigenous children and youth made up the amount in the welfare system. And this was similar to Saskatchewan, with Indigenous youth and children being overrepresented by 3 times non-Indigenous. And if you go next. So this is another pathway to exploitation, is the transition off the reserve. So a lack of support network in the city. A paper from Dustin Louie, he did some interviews with social workers, survivors, other workers. And so a social worker in PA said, "There are no programs available for the adjustment from the reserve to the city. We have kids here who have been banished from the reserve for crimes and ended up with a relative in PA. They lost their family and community, and a judge tells them they cannot go back to the reserve." So by throwing an individual into a situation where they have no support system, it makes them more desired to have a community in any way, shape, or form. So this kind of goes back to the story that I mentioned about the girl being trafficked in Calgary. Her desire to be liked so deeply caused her to fall in love with her exploiter and eventually be sex trafficked. So this also creates easier targets for exploiters as they have less support and are more desperate for the relationships. And because of the invisibility and lack of attention, Indigenous women and girls are extremely vulnerable to being targeted for human trafficking. And as Jacqueline said, the average age of recruitment is 13 years old. And then next, the relationship with services. This was another pathway that was noted in Dustin Louie's dissertation. So from other interviews, the survivors noted a lack of responsiveness from their point of view. They found that basic needs intended to provide a safety net for the most vulnerable populations in society were sometimes not sufficiently responsive to their needs. Survivors, not staff, mentioned poor relationships with services as a pathway and said that the blame was assigned to the troubled individuals instead of questioning the lack of responsiveness in the system. And this is similar to Indigenous women's experiences in the healthcare system, which kind of represents experiences with other services, which are sometimes shaped by racism, discrimination, and structural inequalities that continue to marginalize and disadvantage Indigenous women. And then just a survivor story. In 2014, a survivor reported her daughter's sexual abuse to police, only to have them not take serious the child's testimony due to the mother's history in the sex trade. Several years later, a babysitter sexually abused her son, and this time she didn't bother reporting the crime because she felt she wouldn't be taken seriously. If you can go next.
So all that being said about services, I also want to reference, so in one of the research studies or research papers that we were going through, they covered multiple agencies that were involved in anti-trafficking work and worked with Indigenous women. And a lot of the survivors interviewed in that study actually said that it was law enforcement that played a key role in their escaping exploitation. They shared that there are various pathways of escaping, including hospitalization, arrest, and even incarceration. But this is something that I really want to kind of highlight to those who are working in the services in any way, like either in medical care or in law enforcement, or even if that's social work or even teachers. I want to be clear that we're not shaming individuals who work in these professions. You know, it's easy to hear all of these things and feel guilty and ashamed. And I want to highlight that it's these services that actually play a huge role in getting women out. But what this also means is that there's a higher responsibility. There's a path forward where services and Indigenous-led organizations and communities need to be in partnership. Right? We need to have open communication where we are going back and forth so that can be trust built, and that takes effort and it takes time. But I just wanted to highlight that just because I know that there's I know that there's a lot of people with like big hearts who want to help, and yeah, they're a big part. But so what we were realizing in our research, though, is that there needs to be more work done farther up the line. Rather than waiting all the way to the point of incarceration to get women out, we need to go farther up. So a few organizations that are doing really amazing work, if you want to go to the next slide, Dad. Oh, sorry, I was ahead of myself.
Okay, well, sorry. It's fine. So we did a lot of research into Indigenous ways of healing, different ceremonies, and etc. So on the left side is Dustin Louie created this figure that's based on the lived experiences by Indigenous girls that experience sexual exploitation. Cyclical experiences occur when the child is exposed to the same pathway as their parents, influencing to reenact the intergenerational trauma. And cultural practices and teachings can be used to show the impact that was caused by colonization and how it led to sex traffickers targeting Indigenous population. So at the one point of the circle, you can see the prevention education part. So that is something that we're trying to focus on. So the first one is a sharing circle. So these are an important part of this. They create a supportive, safe, caring, and trusting space that integrates Indigenous culture into the conversations. They also share wise practices, feelings, emotions, as well as like training tips, information, and they allow the participants to process their feelings and emotions and experiences in relation to the information. The next is art-based learning. So this is the making of moccasins, beadwork, skirt making, coloring, story making, anything that would use the creative mind. And so these activities accompanied with conversations about exploitation or anything that could be triggering, for example, just allows the individual to mute out the conversation if they're feeling triggered, put their energy into the artwork that they're doing rather than the conversation, and then when they're ready to step back into the conversation, they can. And then that goes into land-based learning, which uses the similar idea as art-based. So this is where elders and knowledge keepers lead learning activities outside to show how to value Indigenous cultures and ways of learning. And so being outside can create that safe learning environment that also provides those type of distractions when having triggering conversations. And yeah, so it's been clear in all of our research that there's success in Indigenous-led culture-based services and helping professions, including child welfare, justice, and family violence. And there's an emphasis on the support of cultural and spiritual teachings and practices that lead to the most beneficial healing.
So if you want to go to the next slide, there's a few really awesome organizations that are led by Indigenous peoples that are doing work to combat exploitation. Maui is actually the only, that we know of, the only Indigenous safe home in Canada for Indigenous women. So if you want to look those up, go for it. The Speak Out Stop Sex Trafficking is actually an organization that is specifically working to create awareness resources, and we actually referenced them early on in the presentation. But there are some really amazing organizations doing great work, but there's definitely not enough to cover 50% of all victims in Canada being Indigenous. So in our research, we learned that, once again, like Jaden said, that there's a need for culturally centered prevention work, right? Like, we're doing a lot of reacting to the problem, but not a lot of preventing it from even happening in the first place. So if you want to go to the next slide. We were inspired by a research paper by an Indigenous professor named Dr. Dustin Louie, and he had a proposal for a prevention education curriculum to share in schools with young Indigenous girls, and we want to essentially do his proposal. We want to bring it to life. And so what we are doing currently is we're working with an elder on a reserve outside of Calgary to begin developing a community-led prevention curriculum to stop exploitation from happening and to better equip Indigenous communities to protect their most vulnerable members using already existing strengths. And Jaden and I aren't going to be the ones developing it, but we want to be partnering with the community to advocate for justice. And Jaden's going to just share a little bit more about what that looks like.
Yeah, so like Jacqueline said, from our research, we've found that there's a very big lack of culturally grounded resources. And something that we were also challenged with was our focus on girls only. By doing this, we were ignoring the fact that boys and individuals a part of the 2S LGBTQ+ community are also being exploited and should be a part of this and need to be a part of this vision as well. So we want to facilitate something sustainable on each reserve the knowledge and resources are there to run something. So our goal, like Jacqueline said, is to just partner and help facilitate something. So we want these to be led by trusted leaders in the community to empower and educate children ages 7 to 15. Not only will this empower the youth, but the leaders and teachers running them. So it'd be facilitated each week. There'd be a 1-hour gathering, and it would feature one of the 3 ways of healing, like the art-based, sharing circles, land-based learning, alongside this curriculum that's focused on prevention education.
So yeah, we're really excited about that. We're kind of coming to a close here soon, so if you want to go to the next slide.
So we've been, for the past year, like we said, been doing research, doing a lot of networking, having meetings, going through papers, books, etc. And it wasn't up till like the last 4 or 5 months that we felt we have all this knowledge now. We've been reading so much. We want to do something more tangible. So we started partnering with an organization called Street Sisters. So they focus on bridging the gap by giving items such as bras, harm reduction supplies, water, warm clothing, etc. And they, on Mondays and Thursdays, will go out downtown Calgary or Forest Lawn and deliver these items to individuals and try and build some relationships. Another one we've been more recently volunteering with is Her Victory. So this is a part of the Victory Outreach Foundation. They work with girls who are impacted by or presently being exploited, victims of domestic violence, or fleeing crisis. They serve meals Tuesdays to Thursdays and can offer hot showers, emergency food, safe place to rest, HS basic testing, resource referrals, future planning, goal setting. And Jacqueline and I have been working in the clothing room, and so it's been really cool to be able to meet people and have conversations, kind of shop with them a little bit. We organize like the shower times, and most importantly, like our goal is just to build relationships. But I think, yeah, that's me pictured with one of the guys there who is suffering with addiction. But it's just cool to kind of also humanize sometimes people who are going through things like this. Lots of times it's easy to dehumanize people who are going through things like that or homeless. So it's just a cool way to hear their stories and hearts, and so it's been something that's been special to both of us.
Yeah, and Jade and I, we were wanting to, we were doing all this reading, and then we realized we don't even know what it's like literally on the ground, like in the streets. So it's been a way for us. We are working to prevent it, but we're also working on the front lines as well, working with people. We go out on outreach where we go walk along one of the last, it's called the Stroll in Calgary, and it's one of the main roads in Calgary where a lot of the women work in the sex trade. So it's been a really transformative process for the two of us, and it's been such an honor to hear a lot of people's stories. If you want to go to the next slide. So Olson and Baskin, who wrote one of the papers that we've referenced a lot, they had a few 6 call to actions essentially for individuals who read the paper, who want to be a part of reconciliation, who want to be a part of justice. Essentially, they're talking about continuously learning, educating at an institutional level and at an individual level. They talk about advocating for justice. So if there's something that you see that is going on that's not right, that is racist, or even people who are in the services, they call us to advocate and step up. They also call us to turn to Indigenous peoples, to their leadership for change. So often we hear all these things, we get so amped up and we go, okay, how can we help? What can we do? And Olson and Baskin, they call us we have to take their leadership. And lastly, they call us to meaningfully engage with Indigenous peoples and incorporate their culture into a lot of our programs. If you want to go to the next slide.
Yeah, so that kind of ends our presentation, but some next steps is to listen and to learn. Like Jacqueline said, it's so important to take the time to, before you say, how can I help, what can I learn? And that was something that Jacqueline and I were both challenged with at the beginning of when we started doing this. Is we were talking with a lady, Holly Fortier, and she's been kind of a mentor to both of us. And we went in being like, okay, what can we do? We want to do something, we want to help. And she immediately stopped us and said, that's not the mentality that's healthy. You need to go into a partnership, which is what can I learn and what can we learn from each other. And so it's important to not have that kind of savior mentality. being like, oh, what can I help of, like, what problem can I fix for this community, but what can we do together that partners and empowers both of us?
Yeah. And so at a practical level, like, what do you guys do with this presentation? You know, like, for those of you watching, what do you do next? The first thing is literally just to learn, right? Like, if you don't know, if some of the things that we talked about were new today and that we only covered the surface, learn about it. Scan this QR code and look at the resources. We have a huge list actually. We have some go-tos for just beginning. We have those courses linked. We have films linked. We have books linked. We have articles linked here. So go to this link and learn. The second one is to show up. Jaden and I, we literally started these partnerships by just showing up to events. So we partnered with an Indigenous youth lodge in Calgary simply by going to their events, and that's how we got partnered with them. There's going to be events happening this month, a lot of them in Regina, for Orange Shirt Day, which is on September 30th, and that honors residential school survivors and those who didn't make it home. The Regina Symphony, I'm pretty sure when I was looking, they're hosting an event as well in Regina on the 30th. There's a link in this document. I'm really plugging this document. There's a link there to a website that actually shares about events that happen across Saskatchewan, and a lot of them in the Regina area. So, like, practically, what do? You just show up. For those my friends who are in Alberta or who are across the country, just literally look up reconciliation events near me. There's things happening all the time. Powwows happen in the summer, and those are open to the public. If you've never been to one, it's a super cool experience to be at. People are quite open. And the third thing that we want to invite you guys into is partnership with Jaden and I. Jaden is actually, I want to just kind of like honor you. Jaden is actually raising her salary to do this. Like, she's not being paid to do this. She's actually relying on individuals to partner with her financially to do this. And so part of her ability to do this comes from our community partnering with us. So once again, for those of you watching online, the link that is in the QR code on the screen here, there's actually a link to donate in that document as well to Jaden. We want you guys to be a part of this with us. I understand that also sometimes financially it's not an option, but we have a newsletter. We'd love to have you guys be a part of it with us, you know, learn with us. Once again, for those watching online, there's a newsletter sign up link in that document that we have linked on the screen here. But I just want to thank you guys so much for coming tonight. Thank you. It means so much for Jaden and I. This is our first kind of entry into awareness, and we're going to be doing a lot more of these kind of seminars in Calgary. So thanks for being our first group and for just like coming on a long weekend. We appreciate all of you guys so much.
Yes.
Yeah, so we can kind of end the presentation here. If anyone has any questions, we'd love to chat, but if you have to go, feel free to kind of head out. But thank you so much, you guys. We appreciate you, and thank you for taking like the first step in reconciliation with us.
Yeah, thanks, guys.